A trophy, that's what it looks like. A statue in a small town square in Enterprise, Alabama, showing a woman holding a beetle over her head. It's not a joke, and it's not modern irony. The people of Enterprise built this monument in 1919 in genuine gratitude to an insect that had just destroyed their entire local economy. This is documented agricultural history, USDA entomology records, and a real, registered historic monument that still stands today. Sit with that for a second. A whole town decided the thing that ruined them deserved a statue. In the next few minutes, you'll see how a single insect crossed an international border, spread through an entire farming region over 3 decades, and somehow ended up honored instead of hated. It starts in 1892, at the edge of a cotton empire that had no idea what was heading toward it. Nothing about that morning felt like the beginning of anything unusual. By the late 1800s, cotton wasn't just a crop across the American South. It was practically the entire economy. Entire states, entire towns, entire family fortunes were built on one single plant, grown across enormous stretches of land year after year. Historians estimate cotton covered more than 30 million acres across the South by the early 1900s, an almost unimaginable concentration of farmland dedicated to one single plant. Land that could have grown a dozen different things instead grew cotton season after season because cotton was what paid the bills. Here's the strange part almost nobody expects. That kind of total dependence on one crop is exactly what made the region so vulnerable. A region growing 5 different crops can absorb a bad year for any one of them. A region growing essentially one crop has no cushion at all. That single fact would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. And in 1892, near the Texas-Mexico border, something crossed into the country that was about to test that vulnerability directly. By 1903, it had crossed into Louisiana. By 1910, Mississippi. Each new state watched it coming for years before it actually arrived. At first, it seemed like a minor local problem contained to a handful of border counties. Here's the part most people never hear about what this insect actually does. The boll weevil is a small beetle native to Mexico and Central America with one very specific and very destructive habit. A female weevil lays her eggs directly inside a developing cotton boll, the part of the plant that actually produces the fiber. When the larvae hatch, they eat the boll from the inside, destroying the very thing the entire crop existed to produce. A serious infestation could destroy a third or more of a farm's entire cotton crop in a single season. Think about what that meant for a family that had planted nothing else. A third of everything, gone, with no alternative income waiting. What no one expected was how relentlessly and how far this insect would travel once it crossed the border. Over the next 3 decades, the boll weevil spread northeast across the entire cotton belt, state by state, almost never reversing direction. Here's a detail worth pausing on. Farmers in each new state watched it coming for years before it actually arrived, powerless to stop it. By the 1910s, it had reached Alabama, and one town in particular was about to feel the full weight of it. Enterprise, Alabama, like most of the surrounding region, had built its entire local economy on cotton. When the boll weevil arrived there around 1915, it did exactly what it had done everywhere else along its path. Cotton yields collapsed. Farmers who had never grown anything else were suddenly facing financial ruin with no backup crop and no backup plan. Local merchants who depended on farmers' cotton money felt the collapse almost as quickly as the farmers themselves. Here's a detail worth pausing on. This wasn't a slow decline farmers could adjust to gradually. It hit fast, and it hit almost everyone at once. Banks that had lent money against expected cotton harvests were suddenly facing a wave of farmers who simply couldn't pay. For a town whose entire identity was built on cotton, this wasn't a bad season. It looked like the end of the local economy entirely. Here's where the story turns in a direction almost nobody sees coming. Around this same time, an agricultural scientist named George Washington Carver had been urging Southern farmers for years to diversify away from cotton. Carver, working at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, had already been researching alternative crops like peanuts and sweet potatoes, developing dozens of practical new uses for them. His research meant that when disaster hit, farmers weren't just guessing at a replacement crop. There was already a body of real agricultural science behind the alternative. Carver would later become one of the most recognized agricultural scientists in the country, largely because of exactly this kind of practical, farmer-focused research. None of this made the crisis painless, But it meant Enterprise wasn't facing total collapse with no direction at all. There was already a documented, workable alternative waiting. Peanuts, an almost desperate choice facing total collapse, is what some local farmers turned to instead of cotton. Peanuts weren't vulnerable to the boll weevil, and as it turned out, the soil around Enterprise was extremely well suited to growing them. What no one expected was how much better peanuts actually performed compared to the cotton they'd replaced. Peanuts, within a few growing seasons, were earning some farmers significantly more money than they had ever made from cotton. Here's the part most people still get wrong about how this transition actually felt at the time. It wasn't a confident, planned pivot. It was farmers, terrified of losing everything, trying something different because the old way had already failed them. The very disaster that had devastated the local economy had accidentally pushed it towards something more profitable and more resilient. Here's the part most retellings skip about how quickly this spread beyond just a few early adopters. Word moved through the community fast, the way it does when neighbors are watching each other narrowly avoid ruin. Notice what actually happened here. The crop that failed didn't just get replaced. The forced diversification made the whole local economy stronger than before. By 1919, Enterprise's business leaders decided this reversal deserved to be marked permanently. They commissioned a monument, not to a person, not to a historical event, but to the insect that had forced the entire change. The statue depicts a woman raising a large boll weevil above her head, and its inscription expresses genuine appreciation for what the insect had done to the town's fortunes. Visitors who don't already know the story tend to assume it's a joke or some kind of ironic modern art installation. Here's the part that still surprises people who see it for the first time. The National Register of Historic Places lists this monument. It's over a century old, not some ironic modern art piece. A town built an actual, official historic monument to celebrate the thing that destroyed its original economy. Stop and picture that for a second. A marble figure, holding the very insect responsible, displayed proudly in the middle of downtown. Here's what's worth knowing if you've ever heard the phrase, putting all your eggs in one basket. Enterprise story is essentially that idea, played out at the scale of an entire regional economy, with an insect as the accidental teacher. Notice what actually survived the whole ordeal. Not the crop, not the old economic model, but the lesson about depending on exactly one thing. The boll weevil didn't mean to fix anything. It was simply doing what boll weevils do. The fixing was entirely a side effect nobody planned. Here's the last piece of this most retellings skip entirely. Enterprise still celebrates the connection today, decades after the original crisis passed. That's the real story, documented in agricultural records, and still standing as an actual monument in an actual town square today. If you want more of these, the real, documented history behind the things that shaped rural America, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer.
And tell us in the comments, had you ever heard of a town building a monument to a pest before this?